The first time I held it, I thought someone had spilled the galley stores. I was standing in the breaking shed at the old Essex Heritage Yard, watching the crew take apart a hull that had sat in the water longer than my own grandfather had been alive, and one of the young lads pried a length of planking loose, and a little run of gray crystals poured out of the gap and across the toe of my boot. I crouched down, rubbed a pinch between finger and thumb, and touched it to my tongue the way you do without ever thinking about it. Salt, plain salt, packed down deep inside the very bones of a warship. I figured some careless quartermaster had stowed a sack in there 200 years ago and simply forgotten it was ever aboard. That is what I told myself. But the yard's oldest hand, a man named Tom Prewitt, who has forgotten more about timber than I will ever manage to learn, just shook his head and gave me that slow smile of his. That salt was put there on purpose, and it is the reason the oak underneath my hand was still hard and sweet and sound after 2 long centuries in the cold and the wet. It was the 1700s, and the greatest navy in the world was quietly losing a war it could not win with cannon. The enemy flew no flag and fired no shot. It grew in the dark and the damp, in the still and forgotten spaces no sailor ever thought to look at, and it ate the ships alive from the inside while they sat peacefully at anchor. The shipwrights had a name for the thing: dry rot. Now that name has fooled honest people for generations, because the wood it leaves behind really is dry, light and brown and crumbling like a stale ship's biscuit, but the creature itself needs water to live. Dry rot is a fungus, a living growth, close kin to the mushroom in the field, and it feeds on the very timber a ship is built from. It sends fine, pale threads creeping through the grain and turns a beam you could once stand a cart horse on into something you can crush to powder in your closed fist. And it did its worst work not out on the water, but at anchor. It killed more ships in the harbor than the open ocean ever managed to. Some of those ships never even got their chance to fight. There are records of proud new vessels, built at ruinous cost, found soft with rot before they were ever floated down the slip. A ship might be laid up, which is the old term for a vessel taken out of active service and moored in reserve, and within a few short years she would be rotten clean through, while a sister ship out working the blockade stayed hard and sound. That puzzle sat at the heart of the trouble. The ships that rested were the ships that died. It got so bad that around the turn of the 1800s, the Admiralty spoke openly of a plague of dry rot loose in the fleet. Whole fortunes in good English oak quietly rotting away at their moorings. Old Tom put the reason to me the way it had once been put to him. A ship at sea breathes. She works in the swell, air moves through her, and salt spray washes clean over every timber. A ship laid up in ordinary, which is the naval phrase for a vessel kept in reserve, does none of that. They would roof her over against the rain, and in the very act of sheltering her, they sealed her tight, and the air inside went dead and still. Rainwater found its way in, as it always will, and had nowhere to drain. Down in the bilges and the tight gaps between her curved ribs, the damp simply sat. Still air, fresh water, and green timber still sweet with sap. You could not build a finer nursery for the fungus if you set out to do it on purpose. And there was one last thing feeding it, the very thing that points us straight at the cure. The rot could not stand salt. The old shipwrights had watched it for generations, how the timbers nearest the waterline that were forever doused in brine were the soundest of all, while the worst rot began deep inside in the dry-seeming places the sea never reached. The sapwood suffered worst, that young pale wood just under the bark still full of the tree's old sugars. Sap feeds the rot. Salt starves it clean out. So they salted the ship. That was the honest phrase for it, and the doing of it was as plain as it sounds. Before I tell you how, let me tell you where, because the where is the clever part. A wooden hull is built up on a spine of curved ribs called frames, the great bent timbers that give a ship her shape, and between one frame and the next sits a void, a hollow space that runs up the inside of the hull behind the planking. In a working ship, those spaces are nothing but dead air. The shipwrights looked at all that empty room and saw a storehouse, and they packed it full of salt. Common, coarse rock salt, the same gray stuff a man would use to cure herring or a side of beef. poured in by the barrow load and tamped down hard into every hollow between the frames from the bilge on up. On the biggest ships of the line, they did not measure it in pounds. They measured it in tons. To carry it into the deep and awkward places, they bored holes, little channels drilled through the timber so a man could pour dry salt down where no shovel would ever reach. And they built salt stops, small boxed compartments fitted along the sides, filled to the brim and closed with a lid so a shipwright could lift it and judge how much had melted away. Because salt does melt, in a manner of speaking. It draws in water, turns slowly to brine, and drains off, so the salting was never done just the once. Right through the long life of the ship, men came back aboard and topped it up, keeping that hidden defense fresh. If holding your own wood dry and sweet is the fight you keep quietly losing, I gathered every old preservation trick I trust into my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. Pitch and tallow, tar and boiled linseed oil, the salt methods and more, all of it laid out plain across 16 chapters. Scan the code there on your screen and it will carry you straight to it. Right then, here is where the old craft turns quietly and completely brilliant. A ship might carry her secret cargo of salt for 50 years and never once fire it from a gun, because it was never a weapon at all. It was armor. And salt does not fight the fungus the way a poison fights a rat in the grain store. It changes the whole small world the wood is living in, so the rot can never get a foothold to begin with. Salt is what the learned folk call hygroscopic, which is a heavy word for a very simple habit. It pulls water toward itself, out of the open air, out of anything damp lying near it, and holds tight to what it takes. Pack a ship's frames with tons of the stuff, and you have set a great thirst loose inside her timbers. Any moisture that seeps into that oak, any rainwater that trickles down behind the planking, gets drawn straight off into the waiting salt, instead of soaking into the grain where the fungus sits and hopes. How a few tons of herring salt could hold back a rot that had beaten the finest navy on earth seemed near enough to magic to me when Tom first explained it. It is not magic at all. It is one plain law of nature. And wherever the salt draws in that water, it makes brine, and brine is a slow death to the rot. There is a law here that any gardener who has ever salted a slug understands deep in his gut without a book to tell him. Water always travels toward the saltier side of things. Set a living thing, a fungus thread or a slug or a fresh green leaf, hard against strong salt, and the water is drawn straight out of it through its own skin, pulled across to the salt of its own accord. The old country folk gave it no name. The scholars later called it osmosis. The rot that needs sweet, still, fresh damp to live suddenly finds itself sitting in a salt marsh, parched clean from the inside out, and it dies where it lies, or never grows at all. The whole ship had become a place where the rot could no longer draw a breath. Pay close attention to that idea, because it is the one that explains everything else you will ever do to keep wood alive. But the salt was never truly working alone, and this is where those old shipwrights showed their deepest wisdom. Almost nobody remembers it now. They had learned across bitter years that no single clever trick ever saves a ship by itself. The salt bought them precious time, but they paired it with two other things, and the three together did what none could do alone. The first was seasoning. Green timber, wood cut fresh from the living tree and still wet with its own sap, is food and drink both to the fungus. So the best and most patient yards would fell their oak and then simply let it sit, sometimes for years on end, stacked with air running through the pile until the sap had gone out of it and the wood had turned hard and calm. Seasoning, they called that waiting, and it cannot be rushed. Half the rot in the wartime fleet came from desperate yards forced to build with green timber because there was no time left to wait. The second thing was moving air. A shipwright by the name of Robert Seppings and other good men like him pushed the Navy hard to cut air scuttles and vents through her decks and bulkheads, so that even a ship laid up in reserve could breathe a little, and the damp could not settle and brood. Salt to starve the rot, seasoning to deny it its supper, and honest moving air to dry it out. Three plain old ideas, standing together like three strong men, leaning their weight on one rope. Now, you are not about to go pouring tons of gray rock salt into the walls of your garden shed, and I would never tell you to. But the principle those shipwrights built by is the very same one that will save the workbench you are gluing up this weekend, and the deck and the gate, and every outdoor thing you have watched go soft and gray and finally give way at the joint. Rot is not really a matter of age at all. It is a matter of water, sitting still in sweet, unseasoned wood with no breath of air to dry it back out. Take away any single one of those three, and the rot loses its grip on your work. So go and do what they did in your own smaller way. Buy your timber as dry and as well seasoned as your purse will allow, and if you must cut it green, then sticker it, which means stacking the boards with little spacers between them, and let it rest under cover a good while before ever you build. Keep the end grain, those thirsty open ends of a board that drink up water like a paper straw, well up off the wet ground and clear of any standing puddle. And mind your joints most of all, because a joint is really just a faying surface, the place where two pieces of wood are drawn tight face to face, and any flat one left facing the open sky will cup the rainwater and hold it there against the grain like a little cistern. On a gate or a bench meant to live out in the weather, bevel the top edge of every rail so the water runs off and away rather than sitting in the corner of the joint and working its slow way in. And give your good work air. A fence post set in a tight collar of concrete that traps the water around it will rot at the line far faster than one set in loose gravel that lets the water drain away and the wood breathe. Where the old craft reached for salt, you have all their other honest preservers to reach for instead. The very ones that kept whole ships alive for centuries before the first tin of modern sealant was ever poured. Boiled linseed oil, worked deep into thirsty end grain over several slow coats, feeds the wood from within and holds the water back. Pine tar, thinned a little and brushed on warm, has guarded ships and barns and old stave churches against the northern weather for 1,000 hard years. Tallow and pitch, laid in the right places, do the same quiet and faithful work. None of it is quick. All of it truly lasts. I learned that the hard way on a workshop door I once sealed up proud with a modern film that looked perfect for 2 whole summers, and then it peeled and let the water creep in behind it, and the rot had taken the bottom rail before ever I thought to look. The old oil never peels on you because it never forms a hard skin that can peel. It soaks in and becomes a part of the wood itself, and it asks only that you feed it again every few seasons, the way you would oil a good handle or a boot. One more trick from the old world, since we are on the subject of posts. Before you ever set one down into the ground, char the bottom foot of it in a good fire until the surface goes black and crackled. Then brush it over with warm pine tar while the wood is still hot. The old fence builders knew this, and so did the Japanese with their blackened boards. The burnt skin and the tar together shut the water and the rot out of the most vulnerable part of the whole post, the buried end you will never lay eyes on again once it is in the earth. And learn to read your own wood before the rot ever gets the upper hand, the way old Tom taught me to read a hull. Take a thin awl, or the point of a knife, and press it into any timber you suspect, up under a rail, along the underside of a post, into the shaded end grain, where the damp likes to linger. Sound wood pushes back and holds firm against the point. Wood that has begun to go will feel soft and spongy, and let the steel sink in without a fight. Give it a knock with your knuckle too and listen close. Good timber answers with a clean ringing note, while rotten timber gives back a dull, dead thud that tells you the heart of it is already gone. Catch it early, and you can cut the bad wood right back to the sound and save the piece. Leave it a season too long, and the rot will have traveled further than your eye can follow, and by then you are not repairing the thing, you are burying it. When Tom Prewitt pressed that fistful of 200-year-old salt into my palm in the breaking shed, he was really handing me the whole reason a few of those grand old wooden warships are still standing with us at all. Go and stand beneath the Victory at Portsmouth someday and lay your hand on her hull. The oak in her ribs is older than most of the nations a man could name off the top of his head, and she is still hard, still holding her shape, still smelling faintly of the sea and the salt they packed into her when a King George sat on the throne. Her crew have been 2 centuries in the ground. The plain men who salted her against the rot are long forgotten, their names gone from every page. But the timber remembers what they did for it, and that is the thing good craft leaves behind in the end. Not the maker, who goes the way all of us go, but the work, standing quiet and true and sound long after the hands that shaped it have gone still. That same patience runs through all 16 chapters of Secrets of the Shipyard, my 150-page guide to wooden tree nails, watertight faying without glue, and joints that only draw tighter as the years pass. The link is waiting down in the description below. And for more craft tested by the ocean and built to outlast the both of us, stay a while here at the Master Shipwright. PVNR L6 Psi QX7 HEVZ89CP.